Major breaking news: Donald Trump and his administration's attempts to shut down the deep state, those unelected bureaucrats that want to rule over our lives. Another major victory for President Trump and his deregulatory agenda and shutting down the deep state, who, of course, are very dangerous to all of our civil liberties and our civil rights, including our right to keep and bear arms. A major win out of the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. We're going to break it down when we come right back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the 4-Box Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, another major win against the deep state. The wins keep on coming for President Donald Trump and his attempts to shut down those unelected bureaucrats who lord over us as if we were subjects or serfs. But this feudalism is going away bit by bit, and another major win today involving the baby, believe it or not, of Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. Specifically, this case involved the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the idea of which came out of the brain, supposedly, of Elizabeth Warren, and she helped create this and oversee this. Now, there's a lot of problems with this particular government agency based in D.C. that is designed to lord over banks in America, and yes, indeed, they were touching fingers with aspects of Operation Choke Point, which included, of course, attempts to shut down everything from payday lenders to gun companies, to pot dealers, to cryptocurrencies and the like. So this is part of the apparatus of deep state bureaucrats that the federal government was using to oversee and harass these kinds of industries. But nevertheless, when Donald Trump got in there, he has announced that he is going to shrink this agency dramatically. And people are very upset about this because in this case of National Treasury Employees Union versus Russell Voigt, they expressed concern that Donald Trump was shutting down a federal agency that had been created by Congress. But President Trump and his team said, that's not what's happening here. We're simply shrinking this agency down to the bare bones to only do what Congress told it must do. And anything beyond its statutorily mandated obligations, of which there are just a few, this agency shall do no more. And as part of this attempt, they fired, or at least they've announced, the president has announced, that they intend to fire, reduction in force or a RIF, around 80% of the almost 2,000 employees that work for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And this is huge news because it is these kind of unelected bureaucrats that are always looking for something to do. And when they do something, they inevitably meddle in the free exchange of money and ideas in the American marketplace and beyond. So nevertheless, the employee unions and all the typical left-wing, suspects, the usual suspects, brought a major lawsuit here arguing that Donald Trump lacked the authority to cut back and reorganize this agency, even though this agency falls within the executive branch. And just as a reminder, we've gone over this quite a bit. And it's very important that you understand this, because one of the ways we protect all of our rights, including our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, is by enforcing the so-called structural Constitution. Because again, there's many different ways that the Founding Fathers set up our government to protect rights. Writing down the Second Amendment was certainly an important aspect of protecting our right to keep and bear arms. But it wasn't the only way to check the federal government from taking away our rights. They also took it away, or I should say they also made it harder to deprive us of our rights by creating the separation of powers between the various branches of government. The executive branch, which is the president, the congressional branch, or the legislative branch, which of course is Congress, and the judicial branch, Article 3, the courts. So here you have another example, and this is what the D.C. Court of Appeals said. They specifically said, look, Donald Trump is the President of the United States. Under Article 2 of the United States Constitution, all executive powers are vested in a, that would be singular, a President of the United States, one person. The Congress was created by Article 1 of the Constitution, the presidency by Article 2, the courts by Article 3. And here you have another example where a bunch of unelected bureaucrats are very upset that they work for the executive branch. Well, guess what, folks? If you work for the executive branch as a W-2 employee for the federal government today, in the executive branch, who do you work for? You work for the executive. The head of the executive branch is Donald Trump. So if Donald Trump wants to fire you or reassign you or do whatever that's appropriate within the confines of the executive branch, he gets to do that under the Constitution. And that's essentially what, we'll break it down in a bit more detail in a second, but that's basically what is a running theme in all these cases against the deep state. So in this particular case, what happened? The federal district court, yet again, had entered a preliminary injunction against Donald Trump, saying that these unelected federal bureaucrats that work for the agency, the CFPB, they had legal claims against Donald Trump on the grounds that they claimed that Donald Trump was in the process of shutting down the agency. Because this agency had been created by Congress, they argued, Donald Trump lacked the authority to shut down the agency. But the Trump administration came back and says, we're not shutting down the agency. We're simply shrinking the agency back to its narrow obligations that it has to do under the law as are enacted by Congress. But anything beyond the most basic obligations of the law, these people are being fired, they're going bye-bye, and they're not allowed to do anything beyond what they have to do at a minimum. They got to do the minimum, they got to comply with the law, but beyond that, no more for this agency. And since I am Donald Trump and I run the executive branch and these people work for the executive branch and I oversee the executive branch, I get to do this. And then this 2-1 decision in National Treasury Employees Union versus Russell Voigt, that's exactly what this decision said. They said that the lawsuit brought by the plaintiffs lacked by and large jurisdiction because if a federal employee feels that they are being adversely affected in their employment, they're fired, they're not getting paid enough, whatever it is, Congress has set up a specific arrangement for this. There is a special statutory scheme under the Civil Service Reform Act where if an employee feels like they're being wrongly treated, mistreated, or they've lost their job wrongly, or any of these things, they can go and bring their argument to the Merit Systems Protection Board. But of course, these employees don't want to do that. They want to go to federal court. They want to go to the usual deep state DC court, district courts, the same district courts that harassed all those January 6 protesters, the same district courts in DC that, harassed Donald Trump and his administration. But that's not allowed. And that's what this decision said. This decision says, look, if you work for the federal government and there's a problem, you have recourse. There's a way to petition the government, but you have to go through the procedure of the Civil Service Reform Act and ask specifically on your own behalf the Merit Systems Protection Board to reinstate you, get the job back, give you back pay, award attorney's fees, whatever it is. But you're not allowed to come to district court just because the federal district courts in D.C. are friendly to you and hate Donald Trump. You still have to go through the process, and there's a process set up by Congress. The same Congress that you claim that Donald Trump is ignoring, you're ignoring too by not following the proper procedure. So the U.S. Court of Appeals here for the D.C. Circuit came out and said, yeah, no jurisdiction. The district court lacks jurisdiction. So because of that, the preliminary injunction that the district court entered against Donald Trump in your favor is null and void. Bye-bye. Another win for Donald Trump. Another loss for the deep state. And then it turns out these plaintiffs were trying to use the Administrative Procedure Act. But this is quite interesting because the federal judges here in the D.C. Circuit specifically said, no can do, no can do. The Administrative Procedure Act is designed to attack a particular regulation that you might think or you believe exceeded the authority that the agency was given by the Congress. But it has to be a final agency action, it has to be a regulation, and you have to argue that it exceeds congressional authority by and large. There's other claims as well, but that's the basic way you use the Administrative Procedure Act. Yet here, they were trying to use the Administrative Procedure Act to vindicate individual employment rights and argue that Donald Trump, as the executive under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, was doing something he shouldn't be doing against the Congress. And the court said, no can do. Basically, what the court here said is, look, courts are not here to monitor and assess whether or not the President of the United States is properly running the executive branch. That's not what we're here for. That's not what the APA exists for. And yet that is essentially the relief that these plaintiffs were seeking against Donald Trump, is that they wanted a sympathetic, deep state, rogue court, anti-Trump court in the Washington, D.C. area to step in and micromanage the operations of this and other administrative agencies, because they don't like how Donald Trump, as the President of the United States, in charge of the executive branch, they don't like how he's operating and running these agencies. So they wanted an Article 3 district court judge to step in and take over the running of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is essentially what they were asking, because they wanted the courts to make decisions about hiring and firing and work assignments and workflow and all this other stuff. And today I'm happy to report the D.C. Circuit said that's not our job. The Administrative Procedure Act, the APA, and no other aspect of federal law gives we in Article 3 courts the authority to step in and babysit and monitor how the president oversees and runs administrative agencies that fall specifically within the executive branch. That's crazy talk. And here's what Judge Greg Katz has had to say in this 2-1 decision about why that is crazy. The plaintiffs here seek to set aside an abstract decision inferred from a constellation of discrete actions to prophylactically ensure that the Bureau can fulfill its statutory mandate. This theory contravenes all of the Administrative Procedure Act's limits discussed above. If the plaintiff's theory were viable, it would become the task of the judiciary rather than the executive branch to basically run the executive branch. So, of course, that's not going to fly, and it didn't fly. And the decision by the district court in favor of these government employees, the deep state, got shut down by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit in a 2-1. And I don't think the Supreme Court's going to touch this. They don't need to. So again, another huge win for Donald Trump, his attempt to deregulate and shrink, and in many instances eliminate deep state unelected officials. And I think it's a great thing. It's great for the economy. It's also great for our freedom. Because the fewer government employees there are, the harder it is for government to tyrannize us, right? We don't want a large government. We want a small government. Smaller government protects our rights. We obviously have too big of a government today, but it's going to take a lot of work to undo literally 60 years of growth and nonsense. But Donald Trump and his administration are certainly working to try to reverse this. But it's a heavy lift. But, right now the trend is somewhat our friend. So let's keep our fingers crossed and the candles lit that Donald Trump can continue to win in court and beyond, because we need him to. Because if we get Chuck Schumer and AOC and Bernie Sanders and the gang back in the White House and in the Congress, our rights will not be safe for a moment, including our right to keep and bear arms. So there you have it, folks. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you follow me on X at 4Boxes Diner. Don't forget to subscribe both to YouTube and to Rumble. And I look forward to talking to you again real soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.